The British Empire was once so vast that it was said the sun never set upon it. At its height, it ruled nearly a quarter of the world's population and controlled territories across every inhabited continent. Yet this global empire did not emerge overnight. Its rise was gradual, shaped by ambition, conflict, trade, and chance. And its fall, though slower, was just as inevitable. This is the story of how a small island nation became the most powerful empire in history, and how that empire ultimately declined. Long before Britain ruled the seas, the islands themselves were contested lands. Celtic tribes, Roman legions, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and Viking raiders all left their mark. In 1066, the Norman conquest reshaped England's political structure, linking it more closely to continental Europe. Over centuries, England evolved from a feudal society into a centralized kingdom. The Magna Carta limited royal power. Parliament slowly gained influence. These early political developments would later distinguish Britain from other European powers, but Britain was still a regional player. The turning point came not from land, but from the sea. By the late 15th century, European powers were racing to discover new trade routes. Spain and Portugal led the way, carving out vast overseas empires. England arrived late to this competition, lacking both wealth and experience. Yet England possessed one critical advantage: geography. As an island nation, survival depended on naval strength. Over time, England invested heavily in shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime warfare. This focus would change its destiny. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked a symbolic shift in power. England had challenged Europe's dominant empire and survived. The age of English expansion had begun. Early English colonies were fragile experiments. In North America, settlements like Jamestown struggled against disease, starvation, and conflict. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations generated immense wealth. Built on enslaved labor, trade became the foundation of empire. Chartered companies, backed by the crown, expanded British influence across oceans. The most powerful of these was the East India Company. Originally formed to trade spices and textiles, the company gradually transformed into a political and military force. In India, it exploited divisions between local rulers, establishing control through alliances, warfare, and economic pressure. What began as commerce evolved into conquest. By the 18th century, Britain was locked in global rivalry with France. Their competition spanned Europe, North America, Africa, and Asia. This struggle reached its climax in the 7 Years' War. Britain emerged victorious, gaining Canada and dominance over global trade routes. The victory confirmed Britain as the world's leading imperial power. But success came at a cost. War debts mounted. To pay for empire, Britain turned to its colonies, especially in North America.
This decision would have consequences far beyond Britain's control. The American colonies resisted British taxation and authority. Protests escalated into rebellion. In 1776, the colonies declared independence. For Britain, the loss of America was a shock, but not the end. Instead of retreating, Britain refocused its ambitions eastward. India became the crown jewel of the empire. Through military dominance and administrative control, Britain ruled over millions. Raw materials flowed to British factories. Finished goods were sold back to colonial markets. The empire functioned as an economic engine, enriching Britain while reshaping entire societies. The Industrial Revolution accelerated Britain's power. Factories, railways, and steamships transformed production and transportation. British manufactured goods flooded global markets. The Royal Navy protected trade routes, enforced imperial control, and suppressed rivals. Britain became the workshop of the world and its policemen. By the mid-19th century, the empire stretched across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. From Canada to Australia, from India to Africa, British influence was everywhere. At its peak, Britain ruled over 1/4 of humanity. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Colonial rule was not welcomed by all. Resistance, rebellion, and resentment simmered across the empire. In India, the uprising of 1857 exposed deep anger toward British authority. Though the rebellion was crushed, it forced Britain to dissolve the East India Company and rule India directly. Across Africa and the Middle East, borders were drawn with little regard for local realities. Colonial administration prioritized order and extraction over stability. The empire was powerful but increasingly difficult to control. As the 20th century approached, global balance began to shift. New industrial powers emerged. Nationalist movements gained momentum. Then came war. In 1914, Europe plunged into the First World War. Britain entered the conflict with the full weight of its empire behind it. Colonial troops fought on distant battlefields. Resources were drained. The war strained Britain's economy and exposed the limits of imperial power. Though Britain emerged on the winning side, the cost was immense. The empire would never be the same. By the time the First World War ended, the British Empire appeared larger than ever on the map. Its territories spanned continents, and its influence seemed unchallenged. Yet appearances were deceiving. The war had drained Britain financially, militarily, and psychologically. Millions had been lost. Industries were weakened. And across the empire, colonial subjects had seen that Britain was no longer invincible. Nationalism was awakening. Between the world wars, Britain struggled to maintain control. Economic hardship at home limited its ability to invest abroad. Colonial administration became increasingly expensive. At the same time, independence movements gained momentum. In India, demands for self-rule grew louder. Leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi promoted mass resistance through nonviolence, undermining the moral authority of British rule. Elsewhere, colonial soldiers who had fought for Britain returned home with new expectations. They had defended an empire that denied them equality. The foundations were eroding. In 1939, Europe once again descended into war. World War II would become the final test of the British Empire. Britain fought from the first day of the conflict. Its empire provided manpower, resources, and strategic bases across the globe. India alone supplied millions of troops, but the scale of the war was unprecedented. British cities were bombed. Trade routes were threatened. The nation survived, but at tremendous cost. Victory in 1945 came with a harsh reality. Britain was exhausted. After the war, global power shifted decisively. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Britain, once dominant, now depended heavily on American financial support. At the same time, the idea of empire was losing legitimacy. Self-determination had become a global principle. The empire began to unravel. The most significant blow came in South Asia. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India, the heart of its empire. The process was rushed and deeply flawed. Partition divided India and Pakistan along religious lines, triggering mass violence and displacement. Millions were affected. Hundreds of thousands lost their lives. Though Britain formally withdrew, the human consequences endured. The empire had lost its crown jewel. Across Africa and the Middle East, change followed. Colonies moved toward independence throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Some transitions were peaceful. Others descended into conflict. Borders drawn during colonial rule often ignored ethnic and cultural realities, leaving behind fragile states. The legacy of imperial decisions continued to shape regional instability. Britain's global presence was shrinking rapidly. In 1956, the illusion of imperial power collapsed completely. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military intervention. The operation failed. International pressure, particularly from the United States, forced Britain to withdraw. The message was unmistakable. Britain could no longer act independently as a global imperial power. The age of empire was over. As colonies gained independence, Britain redefined its role. The Commonwealth replaced empire, a loose association of former colonies connected through shared history rather than control. Some nations maintained close ties. Others distanced themselves. At home, Britain faced transformation. Immigration from former colonies reshaped British society. The economy shifted away from industry towards services and finance. London evolved into a global financial center. Britain was no longer an empire, but it was still influential. The Cold War further limited Britain's global ambitions. Military commitments were increasingly shared through alliances like NATO. Foreign policy aligned closely with the United States. While Britain retained nuclear weapons and a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, its role was no longer dominant. Power had dispersed. Today, the British Empire exists only in memory, maps, and legacy. Its impact remains complex and contested. On one hand, it spread institutions, infrastructure, and global connections. On the other, it enforced exploitation, inequality, and cultural disruption. The modern world, from borders to languages to legal systems, still bears its imprint. The rise and fall of the British Empire is not merely a story of conquest and decline. It is a lesson in power, how it is built, sustained, and ultimately lost. Empires rise when conditions align. They fall when those conditions change. Britain's empire shaped the modern world, but it could not escape history itself.